My name is Alina Voss, Nora, to everyone who's ever mattered to me, and I'm 45 years old, a medical social worker at Millbrook Regional Medical Center in Millbrook, Vermont, the kind of job where you spend your days helping strangers plan for the worst day of their lives and somehow forget to plan for your own. I'm sitting in a conference room on the second floor of Senate and Doyle Law offices on a gray Thursday in November, 11 days after we buried my father, and I am watching my brother Gary hand our family's attorney a folder he brought himself, already tabbed, already organized. While the attorney nods along like this is simply how things are done. The room itself is unremarkable: beige walls, a long oak table that's seen decades of families sitting exactly where we're sitting now, a box of tissues placed at the center with the particular deliberateness of an office that has learned, through long experience, exactly how these meetings tend to go. I remember noticing, absurdly in that first moment, the faint smell of coffee from a pot someone had brewed down the hall, and thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could be happening in the same room where the next hour of my life was about to be quietly rearranged. "We wanted to save everyone some time," Gary says, not quite looking at me. "Denise and I met with Bradley on Tuesday just to walk through the numbers before today, so we're not all sitting here confused." I didn't know about Tuesday. Nobody told me there was a Tuesday. "You met with the attorney," I say, "about our father's estate without me." "It wasn't a secret meeting, Nora," Denise says, already reaching for the tissue box that's been sitting on the conference table since before we walked in, as though she'd requested it be there. "We just wanted to understand what we were walking into. You're always so calm about this stuff. We needed a minute to process." Bradley Sennett clears his throat and opens the folder in front of him. Our father's will, dated 6 years ago, the one I am told is the only will on file, and begins to read, in the flat, practiced voice of a man who has read 100 of these and learned not to let his face do anything while he does it. Voss Hardware and Feed, along with the 4 rental properties on Cedar and Maple Street that my father spent 30 years accumulating, goes to Gary. The investment accounts and the certificates of deposit, $410,000, give or take, go to Denise. And to me, the daughter who moved into my father's house 6 years ago, who quit down to part-time hours at the hospital to be there for him, who drove him to more appointments than I can count and slept in the room next to his for the better part of half a decade. To me goes the contents of the household, including personal effects and the jewelry of the late Helen Voss. The house itself, the one I have been living in, the one I gave up my own apartment for, is to be sold, with the proceeds split 3 ways, after what Bradley calls a right of first refusal that gives Gary's property management company the option to buy it below appraised value before it ever reaches an open market. I sit very still while he reads all of this. I don't ask a single question. I don't cry, though I can feel Denise watching me for exactly that, the way you watch a pot you're hoping will finally boil over so you can say you saw it coming. What I do instead is remember something my father said to me 18 months before he died. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, sitting in his recliner with his hand in mine, his voice steadier than it had been in months. I hadn't thought about that sentence in a while. Sitting in that conference room, listening to a will that didn't sound anything like the man I'd spent 6 years caring for, I find myself thinking about it very clearly indeed. I want to describe the rest of that meeting because I think the ordinariness of it matters. Bradley Sennett moved efficiently through the remaining paperwork: signatures, notarizations, a timeline for the house to be listed once probate cleared, Gary's property management company already positioned conveniently to make the first offer. Denise asked a handful of questions about the investment accounts, practical, reasonable questions, and Bradley answered each one patiently. Gary asked about the timeline for transferring the store's ownership paperwork, eager, I noticed, in a way that struck me as almost unseemly for a meeting held 11 days after our father's funeral. Nobody asked me a single question the entire hour. Nobody asked whether I had somewhere to live once the house sold. Nobody asked what 6 years of caregiving had actually cost me in dollars or in anything else. I sat at that table, in the same chair I'd sat in as a child during family meetings about the store, and I signed where Bradley indicated, and I said very little, because I had spent 30 years perfecting the specific art of saying very little in rooms where my own interests were being quietly settled by other people. Because if my father really meant what he told me that Tuesday, then the document Bradley Sennett is holding in his hands right now is not the only one that exists. And somewhere between that ordinary afternoon and this gray November morning, somebody made very sure I would never see the other one. Welcome back if you've sat with me before, and hello if this is your first time, if you've ever done the quiet, invisible work of holding a family together while everyone else got remembered for showing up once. This one's for you. Drop a comment about your own experience and subscribe if you want more stories like it, because this one is only getting started. The Rewind. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because a will reading is never really about 11 days of grief. It's about a lifetime of arrangement, and ours got arranged a long time before my father ever got sick. I was the middle child, born between Gary and Denise. And if you'd asked anyone in Millbrook to describe the three Voss kids growing up, they'd have given you the same three words without hesitation. Gary was the businessman, Denise was the baby. And I was the reliable one, which sounds on paper like a compliment, and took me most of my adult life to understand was really just a job description nobody ever offered to pay me for. My father, Walter Voss, ran Voss Hardware and Feed on Main Street for 40 years, the same store his own father had started. And from the time Gary was 14, Dad brought him into the back office to learn the books. The two of them huddled over ledgers while my mother kept the house and I did my homework at the kitchen table close enough to hear them. I remember specifically being 9 years old and asking if I could learn the books too, and my father laughing not unkindly and saying, "This is Gary's someday, sweetheart. You've got other things you're good at." I didn't understand at 9 that he'd just told me gently and permanently that the store was never going to be mine to inherit an interest in, only ever mine to help maintain from a respectful distance. Denise was born 6 years after me, and by the time she was old enough to have a personality, my mother had already decided the family had used up its allotment of expectations on Gary and me. Denise got to be simply, uncomplicatedly adored the late baby, the surprise, the one my father called my little chickadee well into her 30s. The one who was never once asked to help with the store's Saturday inventory the way Gary and I both were from age 12 onward. I don't say this to suggest Denise didn't earn some of that affection honestly. She was, and is, genuinely warm in a way that draws people to her. I say it because affection and obligation got split down two entirely different lines in our house, and I ended up on the wrong side of both. There's a specific memory I want to give you from when I was 16. Gary, 23 by then, had just bought his first rental property with money my father co-signed for, and there was a small celebration dinner at the house. My mother made a roast, my father gave a toast about the next generation building something. I remember sitting at that table, having spent the entire summer working unpaid at the store's front counter so my father could focus on the property closing, and not once hearing my own name mentioned in the toast. I wasn't hurt exactly, not in a way I could have named at 16. I just quietly filed it away the way I'd file away so many similar evenings over the following 3 decades. Proof, collecting slowly, that showing up reliably and being celebrated were two entirely separate currencies in my family, and I had apparently only ever been issued one of them. The second memory is from my mother's funeral 11 years before this story really begins. My mother, Helen, died of ovarian cancer when I was 34, and in the 18 months of her decline, I was the one who drove her to chemotherapy, who sat with her through the long afternoons, who eventually helped my father bathe her in the final weeks when the hospice aid wasn't scheduled. Gary visited on weekends when his properties allowed. Denise flew in twice, both times for less than 72 hours, both times treated, upon arrival, like the guest of honor at a homecoming, my father's face lighting up in a way I never once saw it light up for me during those same 18 months. At the funeral itself, my father held Denise's hand through the entire service and asked me quietly beforehand if I could handle the caterer and the guest book, because I was so good at handling things. I handled the caterer and the guest book. I also handled, alone in the parking lot afterward, the first time I ever let myself cry about my mother, because there hadn't been a moment inside that church where anyone had thought to ask how I was doing. The third memory, and the one that I think explains the will reading more than any other, happened 4 years before my father's diagnosis. Gary was expanding, buying the third of what would eventually be 4 rental properties, and came up $18,000 short on the down payment. My father gave it to him without hesitation, framed as an investment in the family business, no paperwork. No expectation of repayment ever discussed out loud. Around that same time, I'd mentioned once in passing that I was thinking about finally going back for my master's in social work, a degree that would have meant a real raise at the hospital and would have cost roughly the same $18,000. My father's response was, "That's wonderful, honey. I'm sure you'll figure out the financing." I did not get an unpaid, unpapered family investment. I got encouragement and a suggestion to look into federal loans. I want to add one more layer to that memory because I think about it often. I did eventually take out those federal loans, and I did complete my master's degree 3 years later at 31, studying at night after full shifts at the hospital, graduating with just over $16,000 in student debt that I was still paying down when my father's diagnosis arrived. I don't say this to suggest my education wasn't worth the cost. It wasn't, and it opened doors in my career I'm genuinely grateful for. I say it because the contrast has never left me. Gary's investment came free and immediate, framed as family loyalty. Mine came at interest, framed as my own personal ambition to manage as I saw fit. Two children of the same father asking for the exact same amount of money in the exact same year received two entirely different answers, and neither of us at the time seemed to notice how much that difference was quietly teaching us about our respective places in the family. I want to be fair to my father here the way I try to be fair to everyone in this story because he was not a cruel man and I loved him enormously, and none of what follows changes that. But by the time he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at 71 years old, the architecture of our family had already been fully built for 30 years. Gary got investment. Denise got adoration. And I got trusted with the actual ongoing weight of everyone's lives because I was, as everyone in that family loved to say, just so good at handling things. I want to add one more piece of context here because I think it explains something about why I never once in 30 years pushed back hard against any of it. My father was not a wealthy man growing up. He built the store and later the rental properties from almost nothing, working 6 days a week for most of his adult life, and there was a real, earned pride in that story that all three of us grew up absorbing along with everything else. He used to say often, "Nobody handed me a thing." I built this with my own two hands, and I intend for my kids to understand what it cost me. I think looking back, that sentence quietly shaped how all three of us understood our own worth in that family. Gary's worth was tied to continuing the building. Denise's worth was tied to being cherished the way my mother had once been cherished. And mine, somehow without anyone ever saying it directly, became tied to simply being useful enough that the whole structure kept standing. I didn't resent that role for most of my life. I actually took a certain quiet pride in it, the way you take pride in being the person a family can always depend on. It took me until my father's final illness to understand how much that pride had cost me, and how little anyone else in the family had ever been asked to share the weight of it. The escalation arc. Year 1, the diagnosis. My father was 71 when the tremor in his left hand finally got bad enough that he agreed to see a neurologist. And the word that came back in March of that year was Parkinson's disease, not a death sentence. The doctor was careful to say, but a slow, unpredictable decline that would eventually require real, sustained help. I was the one who took him to that appointment. Gary had a closing that morning. Denise was in Burlington and said she'd come up as soon as things settled. I sat beside my father in the small examination room and held his good hand while the doctor explained staging and medication and the eventual likelihood of falls. And I remember my father's first words in the car afterward, quiet, almost apologetic. "I don't want to be a burden on anybody." "You won't be," I told him, and I meant it genuinely in that moment. I didn't yet understand what not being a burden was actually going to cost me over the following 8 years, only that I intended to make it true for him. The first specific financial incident came that June. Grab bars and a raised toilet seat and a shower bench, installed by a contractor I hired and paid for myself, out of my own savings, $640, because my father's Medicare supplement didn't cover home modifications and nobody else offered. When I mentioned it to Gary, mostly just as information, not as a request, he said, "That's really good of you, Nora. You're just better at this stuff than I'd ever be." It was the first time I heard the sentence that would become the family's favorite explanation for why I kept absorbing costs nobody else offered to share. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of admiring deflection, one that complimented my competence in the same breath it excused everyone else from needing any of their own. My rationalization that year was simple and I believed it completely. He's my father and this is early. It's not going to be like this forever. I can carry the beginning of this. I didn't yet know how long the beginning was going to last or how much of what came after it would still be called by everyone else just the beginning. I remember a conversation with a coworker that same summer, a nurse named Bethany who'd gone through something similar with her own mother years earlier, who told me almost in passing, "Watch how the family talks about the beginning, Nora. In my experience, everybody's very generous in the beginning. It's whether that generosity holds up 3 or 4 years in that tells you what you're actually dealing with." I remember nodding politely, not really absorbing the warning, the way you don't absorb most warnings before you've lived long enough to need them. It would take me the better part of 6 years to understand exactly how right she'd been. Year 2, the bookkeeping. By the second year, my father's tremor had progressed enough that his handwriting, always meticulous, had become nearly illegible, which mattered more than it might sound, because my father still insisted on doing his own books for the store by hand, a stubbornness Gary found sort of sweet and never once offered to actually address. I started doing his personal bookkeeping that spring, not the store's books, which remained entirely Gary's domain, but my father's personal accounts, his Social Security, his pension from 30 years of small business ownership, his growing pile of medical bills. It took roughly 4 hours a week, unpaid, folded into evenings after my hospital shifts. I remember the specific system I built for him that spring, color-coded folders for each category of expense, a running spreadsheet I updated every Sunday night, a simple one-page monthly summary I'd read aloud to him so he could stay oriented to his own finances even as his ability to manage the details himself continued to slip. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't even work anyone but the two of us ever really saw. But it gave my father a sense of continued control over his own life that I think mattered enormously to his dignity during those early years, and I've never regretted the hours it took, even now, knowing what I know about how invisible those hours turned out to be to everyone else. When Denise visited that August, for 4 days, she remarked warmly over dinner, "I don't know how you keep all this straight, Nora. Dad's so lucky to have you." Nobody in that conversation asked whether I might want a break from keeping it straight or whether Denise, home for 4 days with nothing but time, might take over a single week of it while she was there. She didn't offer, I didn't ask. That's the shape our family took its meals in for years. Gratitude offered freely, relief offered never. The specific dollar figure of that year was $2,100. The cost, over 12 months, of my father's growing list of medications not fully covered by his supplement. Most of it quietly paid from my own checking account because I didn't want to bother him with the numbers while he was still adjusting to the diagnosis. I told myself that year it's temporary until his supplement plan renews and covers more of this. The plan renewed. The coverage didn't meaningfully improve. The $2,100 simply became, without anyone deciding it out loud, an annual figure. I want to give you one more piece of that August visit with Denise because it's small but I think it's revealing. On her third night in town, she suggested we all go out to dinner, her treat, she said warmly. "To give you a break from cooking, Nora, you deserve it." It was a genuinely kind gesture and I appreciated it in the moment. But I remember noticing, quietly, that the gesture itself cost perhaps $80 for the evening, a fraction of what I was already spending monthly just to keep my father's medications filled. And that this single visible act of generosity seemed to satisfy, for Denise, an entire year's worth of obligation in a way that my own invisible, ongoing contributions never seemed to satisfy anyone's sense that I, too, might occasionally need a break paid for by someone else. The warmth of year 2 came from my father himself, and I want to give it to you honestly because this story isn't only about what was taken from me. That September, on an ordinary Sunday, he asked me to sit with him on the porch, and he said, apropos of nothing, "You know, Nora, I don't say this enough, but you're the one who actually shows up. I see it. I want you to know I see it." I remember that sentence carrying me through a genuinely difficult winter that followed. I didn't yet know how much weight I'd eventually need that single sentence to carry, or how differently the rest of the family would come to interpret what showing up was actually worth. Year 3, This is the year I moved into my father's house permanently, and I want to slow down on it because it's the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. My father had a fall that February, a bad one, a fractured wrist, 4 days in the hospital, and when he came home, it was clear he couldn't safely live alone anymore, not full time. There was a family conversation about it at Gary's house over a Sunday dinner Denise flew up for. I remember the conversation lasting perhaps 20 minutes before it arrived, almost casually, at its conclusion. "You're already so close to him, Nora," Gary said. "And you're not married, no kids at home. It'd be so much harder for Denise and Todd to relocate, and obviously I've got the store and the properties. I can't just step away from that. It really does make the most sense for you." I want to name now what that sentence actually was because at the time it sounded like simple logistics. It sounded reasonable. What it actually was three adult siblings deciding in 20 minutes that the sibling with the smallest visible obligations, no spouse, no children, just a part-time nursing career and an apartment lease, had by default the least valuable life to disrupt. Nobody asked whether I wanted to give up my apartment. Nobody asked whether cutting my hospital hours to part-time would affect my own retirement contributions, my own future. The math of that conversation only ever ran in one direction: what it would cost Gary and Denise to help versus what it would cost me, and the second column was simply assumed by everyone, including, I'm ashamed to admit, me, to be worth less. I want to be honest about something I've never said out loud to anyone but Priya. Some part of me sitting at that dinner table actually felt a flicker of relief at being chosen. 34 years old, no husband, no children of my own despite one serious relationship in my 20s that hadn't worked out. I think some quiet, unexamined part of me had been waiting my whole life for a moment when my family would finally, explicitly, need me for something only I could provide. I said yes to that Sunday dinner conversation almost before Gary finished making his case, not because I felt pressured into it exactly, but because being needed in that moment felt like being chosen, and I hadn't yet learned to tell the difference between the two. I gave up my apartment in April. I cut my hospital hours from full-time to .6, a decision that would cost me, over the following 6 years, roughly $41,000 in lost wages and retirement matching, a number I wouldn't actually calculate until much later. I moved into the bedroom next to my father's, the one that had been my childhood room, and began what would become 6 years of daily, hands-on caregiving. Medications at set hours, meals, physical therapy exercises, doctor's appointments, the small, exhausting logistics of a body slowly losing its own cooperation. My rationalization that year was the one I'd return to again and again over the following 6 years. Someone has to do this, and I'm the one who can. That's not a burden, that's just love, and love doesn't keep score. I believed that sentence completely for years. I want you to notice, the way I eventually had to notice, that love doesn't keep score is a sentence that only ever gets said to the person doing all the giving. Nobody ever says it to the person doing all the taking. I want to add one more layer to that first year of caregiving, because I think it's important not to skip past how disorienting the adjustment actually was. I'd been a working, independent adult for 16 years by that point, my own apartment, my own schedule, my own life carved out around a demanding but genuinely fulfilling career. Moving back into my childhood bedroom at 39 felt, some nights, like a kind of quiet erasure, even as I told myself firmly that it was the right and loving choice. I remember lying awake in that same room I'd slept in as a teenager, listening for my father's movements down the hall in case he needed help in the night, and feeling a strange, doubled sense of time, both fully myself, an adult woman making a significant sacrifice, and somehow also 16 again, back in the same room, under the same roof, waiting to be noticed for something. Year 4, the bridge loan. By year 4, my father's condition required a home health aide 3 mornings a week, which his supplement covered only partially, leaving a gap of roughly $300 a month that I absorbed without much discussion, folding it into what I'd started to think of privately as simply the cost of being the one who stayed. But year 4 is also when I learned something about Gary's management of my father's finances that I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. My father had given Gary power of attorney over his financial accounts 2 years earlier, a reasonable decision on its face, given Gary's business background and one I'd supported at the time, relieved, honestly, not to have to add financial oversight to everything else I was already carrying. That October, I overheard part of a phone call between Gary and my father's hearing having declined enough that he often had calls on speaker without realizing it. Gary was explaining that he'd moved $12,000 from Dad's investment account into the rental property business, calling it a bridge loan just until the Cedar Street refinance closes, his voice easy, reasonable, the voice of a man discussing something entirely routine. "That sounds fine, Gary," my father said. "You know best." I didn't say anything that day. I told myself it wasn't my business. Gary had the legal authority, my father had given his verbal blessing, and questioning it felt like exactly the kind of interference I'd spent years being careful never to be accused of. But I want to name the discomfort I felt quietly because it turned out to matter enormously later. A bridge loan implies a bridge back. I never once, in the 4 years that followed, heard any mention of that $12,000 being repaid to my father's account. I simply filed it away, the way I'd filed away so much else, in the part of my mind that was apparently keeping a ledger long before I consciously decided to. One line from that period has stayed with me clearly. When I gently mentioned to Gary that November that Dad's accounts seemed to be running a little tighter than I'd expect given his pension and Social Security, Gary said, "Nora, I've got this handled. You focus on the day-to-day, I'll focus on the money. That's always been the deal, right? You're just better with people and I'm better with numbers." It sounded like a compliment. It was also, I'd eventually understand, a very effective way of ensuring nobody but Gary ever looked closely at the numbers at all. I want to add something else from that year, a detail I didn't understand the significance of until much later. That December, I asked my father casually over dinner whether he still felt comfortable with Gary managing everything financially, mostly because I'd started noticing small inconsistencies, a maintenance bill for the store that seemed high, a quarterly statement that arrived a full month late. My father's answer was simple and, in hindsight, heartbreaking in its trust. "Gary's got a good head for this, Nora, better than I ever did probably. I don't need to understand every line of it. I just need to know somebody in this family does." I remember thinking, at the time, that this was exactly the kind of generous, uncomplicated faith a good father should be able to have in his son. I didn't yet understand how completely that faith had removed any check on how Gary chose to interpret handling it. The question I didn't ask. There's a smaller chapter I want to include here, out of order chronologically but not out of place emotionally, because I think it explains something about why I let so much of this go unexamined for so long. Late in year 4, my father's neurologist recommended a second opinion at a specialty clinic in Boston, roughly 2.5 hours away, a consultation that would cost $1,100 out of pocket even after insurance. I mentioned it to Gary, hoping, as I often did in those years, that this might be the request significant enough to finally prompt an even split among the three of us. Gary's response was measured, reasonable sounding, the kind of sentence I'd come to recognize later as the exact shape of the manipulation running underneath this entire story. "Honestly, Nora, do you really think the trip's necessary? The neurologist here seems solid and Boston's a lot of driving for Dad at this stage. I don't want to spend the money if it's not going to change anything." I want to be clear that this wasn't an unreasonable question on its face. Reasonable people can disagree about whether a second opinion is worth the cost and the physical strain of travel. What made it revealing, in hindsight, was the asymmetry underneath it. This was the same year Gary spent $12,000 of our father's own money on a bridge loan to his rental business without a second thought. Yet $1,100 for a medical consultation prompted immediate, careful scrutiny. I ended up taking my father to Boston myself, paying the full $1,100 from my own savings, because the specialist's assessment ultimately did change his medication regimen in a way that measurably improved his quality of life for the better part of a year. I never brought the cost up to Gary again. I simply filed it away, the way I filed away nearly everything else that decade, in the growing silent ledger that would eventually become the folder I brought to that conference room. Year 5, the anniversary nobody remembered. I want to give you a warmth beat here because year 5 wasn't only difficult, and I don't want to tell this story as unrelieved misery. That March marked what would have been my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, and my father, on a good day, mentioned wanting to do something small to mark it, nothing elaborate, just a dinner, maybe looking through old photographs. I organized it in 2 weeks, a quiet evening at the house, a photo album I put together from boxes in the attic, a cake from the bakery my mother had always loved. Gary came for 90 minutes and left early for a tenant issue. Denise called the morning of to say she couldn't make the drive from Burlington but would definitely visit soon. What I want to tell you about that evening isn't the absence of my siblings. By year 5, I'd stopped expecting much else from that particular column. What I want to tell you is what happened after they'd all gone. My father, looking through the old photographs at nearly 11 at night, long past his usual bedtime, took my hand and said, "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become, Nora. I hope you know that. I hope I've told you that enough." I remember that evening as one of the genuinely good nights of that entire 6-year stretch, not because it fixed anything about the larger pattern, but because it was real, uncomplicated tenderness between the two of us, the kind I never had to share credit for or wonder whether it came with strings attached. That same spring, I also want to mention Priya Anand, my closest friend from the hospital, a palliative care nurse who had by that point been quietly checking in on me for 2 years, bringing dinner on my hardest weeks, covering shifts so I could take my father to specialist appointments, never once making me explain or justify why I needed the help. Priya would become, later, one of the 2 voices who helped me finally see the shape of everything clearly. But even in year 5, before any of that reckoning began, she was already the person who made me feel, reliably, that at least one relationship in my life ran on genuine reciprocity rather than quiet, permanent obligation. I remember a specific evening that October, one of the ones Priya covered my shift for so I could take my father to a specialist appointment 2 hours away. When I came home exhausted, later than expected, to find she'd let herself in with the spare key I'd given her and left a full dinner warming in the oven along with a note that simply read, "You don't have to thank me for this. I just wanted you to have one less thing to think about tonight." I've kept that note in a drawer in my desk ever since, not out of sentimentality exactly, but because I think it's the clearest example I have of what unconditional actually looks like in practice, set against everything else in this story that only ever looked unconditional from a careful enough distance. The specific dollar figure of year 5 was $4,200, a stairlift installed that summer after my father's mobility declined further, a cost his insurance didn't cover at all. I paid for it in full from savings I'd built slowly over 2 decades without asking Gary or Denise to split it, because by that point I'd stopped expecting the ask itself to go anywhere productive. I remember thinking, installing that stairlift, a specific, quiet thought: I have now personally paid for every single modification this house has needed. I wonder if anyone besides me has ever noticed that. Year 6, the numbers get harder to ignore. By year 6, my father's decline had accelerated. More falls, more confusion on his harder days, a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment layered onto the Parkinson's that made him increasingly dependent on me not just physically but administratively, for tracking his own medications, his own appointments, his own finances. I want to describe what an ordinary week actually looked like by that point because I think the phrase caregiving can sound abstract until you hear the specifics. Mondays and Thursdays I drove him to physical therapy 40 minutes each way. Tuesdays, the home health aide came in the morning, which gave me a narrow window to catch up on my own hospital paperwork before my afternoon shift. Wednesdays and Fridays, I managed his medications myself, 11 separate prescriptions by that point, timed across the day, some requiring food, some requiring an empty stomach, a puzzle I solved fresh every single morning. Weekends, I did the grocery shopping, the laundry, the small home repairs that came up constantly in a house built in 1968. All while making sure my father had company, conversation, some thread of connection to the world beyond his own declining body. I don't say any of this for sympathy. I say it because I think it's important, in a story about paperwork and inheritance, not to lose sight of what the actual, physical texture of those years was made of. It was that year I finally did the math I'd been avoiding, prompted by an offhand comment from Priya during one of our Sunday coffee catch-ups. "Nora, have you ever actually added up what you've spent on your dad's care versus what Gary and Denise have put in?" I hadn't. I went home that afternoon and did it for the first time properly, and the number that came back, modifications, medications, aid gap coverage, $41,000 in foregone wages and retirement contributions from cutting my hours, landed somewhere close to $63,000 over 5.5 years. Gary's total contribution, as far as I could reconstruct it, was roughly $11,000. most of it the original stairlift quote he'd gotten but never actually paid toward. Denise's total contribution was, near as I could tell, $0, offset entirely by frequent warm phone calls that everyone, including my father, seemed to genuinely value, as though warmth and money occupied the same column. I mentioned the imbalance to Gary that October, carefully, factually, without accusation, I did some rough math and I think I've put in a lot more than either of us probably realized. Gary's response is one I want to give you verbatim because it's the clearest single piece of guilt dressed as value in this entire story. Nora, come on. You know money was never really the point for you. You've always been the one who does this out of love, not out of what you get back. That's kind of what makes you you. I remember sitting with that sentence for a long time afterward. It sounded on the surface like praise. What it actually did, I eventually understood, was quietly reclassify $63,000 of real financial sacrifice as a personality trait, something I simply was, rather than something I had chosen and could, at any point, choose differently. It's a remarkably efficient piece of machinery, that sentence. It compliments the giver so warmly that objecting to the terms of the exchange starts to feel like a betrayal of your own character, rather than a reasonable request for fairness. I brought the number up one more time that year, differently, hoping a more concrete framing might land better than the first attempt had. I suggested carefully that perhaps the eventual estate could simply account for the difference, that when the time came, whatever I'd put in above and beyond what Gary and Denise had contributed could be reflected in how things were eventually divided, rather than requiring anyone to write a check right now. Gary's response to that framing was, if anything, more revealing than the first. Let's not get ahead of ourselves talking about the estate while Dad's still here, Nora. That feels a little morbid, don't you think? I remember the specific whiplash of that sentence, the same brother who talked openly in year 7 about the store coming to him eventually, while our father was very much still alive, telling me in year 6 that raising the exact same subject on my own behalf was somehow morbid. The rule, I slowly came to understand, was never actually about propriety. It was about who got to raise the future out loud and who was expected to wait quietly and trust. That's the machinery of it. If I'm honest with you now, looking back on that October conversation, praise substituted for reimbursement, character substituted for accounting. Nobody ever had to argue that I didn't deserve to be repaid. They only ever had to convince me that wanting to be repaid wasn't really who I was. Year 7, the store. Year 7 is when I first heard, directly, the sentence that would come to define the will reading itself, 18 months before my father's death. Gary had been managing the store day-to-day for nearly 3 years by then, my father's tremor having made the physical work impossible and his cognitive decline making the bookkeeping unsafe to trust to him alone. Over a family dinner that spring, one of the rare ones Denise attended in person, Gary mentioned, easily, almost as an aside, obviously the store's going to come to me eventually. Dad and I have talked about it. It just makes sense, given everything I've already put into keeping it running. I remember the specific quiet that followed that sentence because nobody at the table, including me, said anything to challenge it. It simply landed and was absorbed the way so many similar sentences had been absorbed over the previous 7 years. I remember thinking, privately, he's put in 3 years of managing it. I've put in 7 years keeping our father alive long enough for there to still be a store to manage. I didn't say that thought out loud. I've wondered many times since what might have been different if I had. I want to add one more detail from that dinner, because it's the kind of small thing that only makes sense in retrospect. My father, sitting at the head of the table, said nothing at all when Gary made his comment about the store coming to him eventually. No correction, no clarification, nothing that would have suggested at that point in the evening that any different arrangement was even under consideration. I've thought about that silence often since finding the codicil. Either my father hadn't yet decided that spring to make the changes he'd eventually make 10 months later, or he had already begun considering them and simply wasn't ready to have that conversation at a crowded dinner table. I'll never know which it was. It's one of several small mysteries about those final years I've had to make peace with never fully resolving. The specific incident of that year involved $800, a relatively small figure compared to some of the others, but one that stuck with me because of how it was handled. My father's primary care physician recommended a specialized mattress to help prevent pressure sores as his mobility continued declining. I mentioned it to Gary, half hoping that year that he might finally offer to cover something outright. Instead, he said, "Why don't you just put it on Dad's card for now, and we'll sort out reimbursement later once I look at the accounts." I put it on my own card instead because Dad's card was, by that point, something only Gary actually had clear visibility into, and some old, careful instinct told me not to create one more transaction that would need Gary's later interpretation to be understood. The warmth of year 7 came through my niece, Gary's daughter Ashley, then 19, home from college for the summer, who spent 3 weeks that August genuinely, unprompted, helping me with my father's care, reading to him in the afternoons, learning his medication schedule, sitting with him so I could finally take a full weekend off for the first time in over a year. I want to describe one afternoon from that August specifically because it's one of the clearest, purest good memories from that entire 6-year stretch. Ashley had taken to reading my father chapters from an old Western novel he'd loved as a young man, and one afternoon I came home early from a rare grocery run to find the two of them on the porch, my father laughing, a real, full laugh when I hadn't heard from him in months, at something Ashley had said, doing a voice for one of the characters. I stood in the doorway for a moment just watching them, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tight for a very long time. That's the kind of afternoon that makes 6 years of hard, exhausting caregiving worth something, regardless of how the rest of the story eventually unfolded. I remember Ashley saying to me quietly near the end of that summer, "I don't think anyone in this family really sees how much you do, Aunt Nora. I see it. I just wanted you to know that." I've held on to that sentence carefully in the years since. It would turn out to matter more than either of us knew at the time. Year 8, the conversation on the porch. Quick note here, since we're well past the midpoint of this story, if any of this is landing for you, drop a comment about your own family's version of the reliable one, and subscribe if you want to see how this one resolves, because it's about to turn in a direction I didn't see coming either. Year 8 brought the conversation I mentioned in the cold open, the one on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 18 months before my father died, that I would spend the rest of this story understanding the true weight of. My father had been having a good week, cognitively clearer than he'd been in months. One of the periods his neurologist called a plateau, when the medication adjustments were working well in his mind. For a stretch, felt almost entirely like his own again. He asked me to sit with him in the living room in his recliner, and he took my hand, and he said, "Nora, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it, because I don't know how many more clear days I'm going to get." "I'm listening, Dad," I said. I want to describe that afternoon a little further, because it's a memory I've replayed countless times since finding the codicil in his desk drawer. The light in the living room was doing the particular gold thing it does in late autumn in Vermont, coming low through the front windows, and my father's hand in mine felt steadier than it had in weeks, his grip firm in a way that reminded me, briefly and painfully, of how his hands used to feel when I was a child holding mine crossing Main Street toward the store. He'd had his physical therapy that morning, a good session, and his medication was, for once, well-timed with his energy, and I remember thinking in the moment, simply, this is a good day. I should enjoy this good day. I didn't yet know it would also turn out to be one of the most important conversations of my life. "I've been to see Bradley," he said, Bradley Sennett, our family attorney, the same one who would later read the 2019 will in that conference room. "I made some changes to the will. I want you to know that whatever happens after I'm gone, I made sure it's fair. I made sure you're not forgotten, Nora. You gave up your whole life for me these last years, and I see it, and I'm not going to let the rest of them pretend I didn't." I remember that conversation vividly, his exact tone, steady and clear in a way his voice hadn't been in months, the particular way he squeezed my hand on the word fair. I asked him gently whether he wanted to tell Gary and Denise about the changes himself, and he said, "Not yet. I want to get the details finalized first. But Nora, I need you to know it's done. I saw Bradley on the 14th. It's done." I didn't ask to see the document. I didn't think in that moment that I needed to. My father had just told me with total clarity on one of his best remaining days that he had gone to our family's own attorney and made a change that would ensure I wasn't forgotten. I believed him completely, the way you believe your father when he's looking you directly in the eye and using the word fair. 10 months later, his cognition declined sharply following a hospitalization for pneumonia, and the clear, steady version of him I'd spoken to that Tuesday afternoon became increasingly rare, replaced by longer stretches of confusion that made any further serious conversation about his affairs impossible. I never got a follow-up conversation about the will. I assumed, reasonably, I thought, that whatever he'd finalized on the 14th was simply waiting quietly in Bradley Sennett's files for the day it would eventually be needed. I did not know, sitting in that conference room 11 days after his funeral, that the document Bradley Sennett read aloud that gray November morning was dated 6 years earlier, 3 years before that porch conversation ever happened. The final months. I want to tell you about the 10 months between that porch conversation and my father's death, because I think it matters that this story isn't simply about a document that got lost. It's about what those final months actually looked like for the person doing the caregiving, while the paperwork that might have protected her sat quietly, unfinished, in a drawer nobody thought to check. After his hospitalization for pneumonia, my father's cognitive decline accelerated in a way his neurologist had warned us could happen, but that none of us, I think, were truly prepared for. There were good days still, scattered through those months, but they came less often, and even on the good days, the clarity rarely lasted long enough for the kind of serious conversation we'd had on the porch. I remember trying twice, gently, to bring up the will, not because I doubted him, but because some instinct, one I wish I'd trusted more fully at the time, told me it might be worth confirming the details were settled. Both times he grew agitated in a way that frightened me, insisting he'd already told Bradley everything, and I backed off both times, unwilling to cause him distress over something I believed genuinely was already handled. The physical demands of those final months were also the heaviest of the entire 6 years. My father needed help with nearly everything by the end: dressing, bathing, eating, the medications that had grown so numerous I kept a laminated schedule taped inside the kitchen cabinet. I was averaging 4 to 5 hours of interrupted sleep a night during his hardest stretches, still working my reduced hospital shifts 3 days a week because we needed the income his pension and Social Security alone couldn't fully cover. Gary visited on Sundays, usually for under an hour, always managing to mention, at some point during the visit, how hard this must be for me, in a tone that sounded like sympathy but never once turned into an offer to actually take a Sunday off my hands. Denise called twice a week, faithfully warm 10-minute conversations that my father genuinely lit up for, and I want to be honest that I never once resented those calls themselves. Only the quiet, persistent fact that a phone call and a physical presence were being weighed in my family's accounting as though they occupied the same column. My father died on a Tuesday morning in October, quietly in his sleep, in the bedroom I had helped him move into 6 years earlier when the stairs first became too much. I was the one who found him. I called Gary and Denise before I called the funeral home, and I remember, even in that first raw hour of grief, some small, tired part of me noting that I was, as always, the one making the calls, handling the logistics, holding the front line while everyone else absorbed the news from a safe remove. I didn't resent it in that moment. I simply noticed it, the way I'd noticed so much else over 6 years, filed away without yet knowing what I'd eventually do with the filing. I want to describe the days between his death and the funeral, because I think they matter to understanding how the will reading was able to unfold the way it did. Gary arrived within the hour and immediately took charge of contacting the funeral home, a task I was grateful in the moment to have taken off my hands. Denise arrived by evening, and the three of us spent that first strange week together in the house, sorting through logistics, choosing readings for the service, greeting the steady stream of neighbors and old customers from the store who came by with casseroles and condolences. I remember thinking that week that this was the closest the three of us had felt in years: genuine, shared grief, none of the old currents visibly running underneath it. It was only later, once Bradley told me about Gary's private visit 6 days after the funeral, that I understood how much of that apparent closeness had already been, quietly, undermined before we'd even finished planning the service. Gary had gone to see Bradley in the middle of that same week I remember as unusually close. The same week we picked out my father's headstone together. The same week Denise and I stayed up late one night going through old photo albums, crying and laughing in equal measure. I've had to make peace with the strange, uncomfortable fact that grief and calculation can apparently occupy the exact same week, in the exact same person, without either one canceling the other out. The discovery. The will reading itself wasn't the discovery. The will reading was only the moment I understood with total clarity that something didn't add up. The discovery, the actual quiet gut punch, came 9 days later on a Saturday afternoon, while I was doing the thing nobody else in my family had offered to help with, clearing out my father's house room by room, the house I was about to lose, so it could be prepared for the sale Bradley Sennett had already begun arranging paperwork for. I was going through the boxes in my father's home office, the small room off the kitchen where he'd kept his personal files for as long as I could remember, when I found a manila envelope tucked into the back of the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of old tax returns. It wasn't hidden exactly. My father was never a man who hid things deliberately. It had simply been put somewhere private, the way you put something you intend to deal with later, before later ran out. Inside was a copy of a document titled First Codicil to the Last Will and Testament of Walter James Voss, dated the 14th of April, 18 months before his death, the exact date he'd mentioned to me on the porch. It named me, Elinor Voss, as executor of his estate, replacing Gary in that role. It left me the house outright, along with a life estate protecting my right to remain in it regardless of what happened to the rest of the estate. And it adjusted the distribution of the rental properties, giving me a 25% ownership stake alongside Gary's. In recognition, the document read in language I could tell Bradley Sennett himself must have helped my father phrase carefully, of the sustained, uncompensated caregiving provided by my daughter Elinor over the course of my illness, without which I would not have been able to remain in my own home. I sat on the floor of that office for a long time, holding that document, feeling something I can only describe as a very quiet, very total kind of stillness. Not shock exactly, because some part of me had clearly been braced for this since the conference room. Just the specific, settling weight of finally having proof for something I'd spent 9 days trying not to fully believe. I want to describe the room around me while I sat there, because I remember it with unusual clarity, the kind of clarity grief and shock seem to produce together, sharpening the edges of ordinary things. Afternoon light coming through the small window over my father's desk, dust motes moving slowly through it. The smell of the office, a mix of old paper and the pipe tobacco he'd quit 30 years earlier, but that had somehow never fully left the room. A photograph on the corner of the desk, my parents on their wedding day, my mother laughing at something just outside the frame. I remember thinking, absurdly in that moment, how strange it was that the room looked exactly the same as it always had, while everything I understood about my family had just quietly, permanently shifted. Tucked behind the codicil was a single handwritten note in my father's shaking but still recognizable script, dated the same day, told Nora it's done. Bradley says needs to be properly executed and witnessed before its final appointment set for the 22nd. Don't tell Gary yet, he'll make it a whole thing. Tell them together once it's official. The 22nd. I did the math without wanting to. My father's hospitalization for pneumonia, the one that began his sharpest cognitive decline, the one that ended any further clear conversations about his affairs, began on the 19th of that same month, 3 days before his appointment to properly execute and witness the very document that would have protected me. I want to describe what I felt reading that note, because I think it's important not to romanticize this moment into something more dramatic than it actually was. I didn't feel rage. I felt something closer to grief layered on top of grief, grief for my father freshly buried who had tried in his last clear days to do right by me and simply run out of time before the paperwork could catch up to his intention. And underneath that grief, quiet and cold, a second question I couldn't put down. If this codicil had never been properly executed, if it truly was only ever a draft sitting unfinished in a drawer, then why had it been printed on Bradley Sennett's own letterhead with his firm's file number already stamped in the corner, the way a document gets stamped only after it's been formally logged into a law office's system? I called Bradley's office first thing Monday morning, calm, factual, giving no hint of what I'd found. I simply asked whether his firm had any additional documents on file related to my father's estate beyond the will read the previous week. There was a pause on the line, a longer pause than a simple record check should have required, before his paralegal said she'd have to look into it and call me back. I spent that weekend before the call doing something I hadn't let myself do in 6 years. I went back through every box in that office, methodically, room by room, looking for anything else that might tell me more about what my father had actually intended in his final clear months. I found old photographs, tax returns going back decades, a shoebox of birthday cards Denise and I had made him as children, and folded into a Bible on his nightstand of all places, a second, shorter note undated that simply read, "Nora deserves better than what she's been given. I mean to fix it before I go." I don't know when he wrote that note. I don't know if it came before or after the codicil, or whether it was a separate thought entirely, scribbled in a private moment of clarity he never got the chance to act on further. I've chosen in the time since to believe it was written with real intention, because the alternative, that it was simply an idle passing thought that never went anywhere, felt like too small an explanation for a sentence that specific. She never called back. Bradley Sennett called instead that same afternoon, his voice careful in a way I'd never heard from him before, and said, "Nora, I think we should sit down and talk. In person. There's something I probably should have brought up at the reading, and I want to explain properly why I didn't." The decision. I want to slow all the way down here because everything that happened after that phone call, the meeting with Bradley, the weeks that followed, the decision about what to actually do with what I now knew is, I think, the real emotional center of this entire story. Finding the codicil was a fact. Deciding what to do with the fact was something else entirely, and it took me the better part of 6 weeks. Bradley Sennett and I met 2 days later in his office without Gary or Denise present. What he told me carefully, in the measured tone of a man aware he was disclosing something that exposed both a client's family and potentially his own firm's handling of it, was this. My father had indeed come to him that April, 18 months before his death, wanting to draft a codicil naming me executor and adjusting the distribution in the way I'd found in the drawer. Bradley had drafted it, exactly as described, and scheduled the formal execution and witnessing appointment for the 22nd, standard practice for a document of that significance. My father's hospitalization on the 19th had postponed that appointment. And in the 18 months between that postponement and my father's death, no one, not my father, not Bradley's office, not, as far as Bradley claimed to know, anyone else had ever followed up to reschedule it. I should have followed up myself, Bradley said, and to his credit, he said it without excuse-making. It fell through the cracks on my end as much as anyone's. I want to be honest with you about something else though, Nora, because I think you deserve to know it before you decide anything. Gary came to see me privately 6 days after your father passed, before the reading. He asked whether there were any other documents on file besides the 2019 will. I told him at the time that there was an unexecuted draft that had never been finalized, and that as far as I understood the law, an unexecuted, unwitnessed codicil has no legal standing regardless of what it says or what your father's intentions clearly were. Gary asked me not to mention the draft at the reading since, in his words, it would only confuse and upset everyone over something that was never actually valid anyway. I agreed to that at the time. I've had 11 days to sit with whether that was the right call, professionally and otherwise. I don't think it was, that's why I called you. I remember sitting in that office chair feeling something crystallize that had been unclear until that exact sentence. Gary had known. Not suspected, known directly from our family's own attorney. 6 days after our father's funeral, and had made a specific, deliberate choice to keep that knowledge from me and from Denise, framing his silence to Bradley as protective concern for the family's peace of mind, when it had in fact protected only the distribution that benefited him most. I asked Bradley before I left his office that day why he'd agreed to Gary's request in the first place, and to his credit, he didn't try to make himself sound better than he'd actually been. "I've known your family for almost 20 years, Nora," he said. "Your father was a good friend as well as a client." When Gary came in, grieving, asking me to keep something quiet that I genuinely believed had no legal weight anyway, it felt, at the time, like a small kindness, sparing a grieving family an extra complication during an already hard week. I didn't think it through the way I should have. I didn't consider that sparing the family and sparing one particular member of the family the ability to know the truth might not actually be the same thing. I'm sorry, Nora, that's not a legal disclaimer, that's just true. I appreciated the honesty, even as I sat with the discomfort of realizing how easily an entire system, an attorney's professional judgment, a family's collective assumption of peace, could quietly bend around whoever asked first and most confidently, rather than around whoever the truth actually belonged to. I called Priya that same evening and I told her everything, the codicil, the note in my father's handwriting, Bradley's confession about Gary's private visit. Priya listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished, she said something I've held on to since. Nora, I need you to hear this clearly because I don't think you're used to hearing it about yourself. You didn't just lose an inheritance. You've spent 6 years being the only person in that family who never once asked what you were owed, and the one time someone finally tried to make sure you got something back, your own brother made sure you'd never find out. That's not a paperwork problem, that's a pattern, and I think you already know it. I sat with that word, pattern, for several days afterward, turning it over the way you turn over something you already suspect is true but haven't yet let yourself fully name. Because underneath the anger I was slowly allowing myself to feel, there was an older, harder question, the one I hadn't let myself examine honestly in 6 years of caregiving. If I hadn't found that envelope, if I'd simply accepted the 2019 will, and quietly moved on the way I've quietly moved on from everything else in this family for 30 years, would any part of me have actually been surprised? The honest answer sitting with it was no. Some part of me had expected exactly this my whole life, without ever once letting myself say so out loud, because saying so out loud would have meant admitting how little my own family's fairness had ever actually been guaranteed to include me. I also went, that same week, to see a grief counselor at the hospital, a woman named Dr. Colette Marsh who ran a support group for adult children caring for aging parents, someone I'd referred my own patients' families to for years without ever once considering I might need her services myself. I told her in our first session about the will reading and about the envelope I'd found, and she asked me a question that stayed with me longer than almost anything else said to me during that entire 6-week stretch. Nora, when you talk about your father's care, you use the word we almost never. You say, I drove him, I paid for it, I moved in. Do you notice that? I hadn't noticed it, not consciously, though hearing it named out loud, I recognized it instantly as true. I suppose I do that because it was mostly just me, I said. I believe you, she said. I'm not challenging the accuracy of it. I'm pointing out that you've spent 6 years living a story that was entirely singular, while your family, as far as I can tell from what you've described, has spent those same 6 years living a story that was entirely we, as in. We're taking care of Dad, we're a family that shows up. Those are two completely different stories about the exact same 6 years, Nora, and I think part of what's so disorienting about this codicil is that it's the first piece of paper that's ever agreed with your version instead of theirs. We spent much of that first session, and 2 more that followed, working through what Dr. Marsh called the singular grief, the specific compounded difficulty of grieving a parent while simultaneously discovering that the story you'd told yourself about your place in the family might not have been the story everyone else was telling. Most people who come to me after a parent's death are grieving one loss, she said in our 3rd session. You're grieving your father, which is enormous on its own. But you're also grieving a version of your family's fairness that you believed in for 30 years, and that second grief doesn't get talked about nearly as much, because it's harder to name and because admitting it can feel like betraying the family you're also trying to hold together. I want you to know both griefs are real, and you're allowed to feel both of them fully without one canceling out the other. I made an appointment with an estate attorney the following week, not Bradley, whose conflict of interest in this matter was now impossible to ignore, but a woman named Renata Ford, recommended by a colleague at the hospital who'd gone through a difficult probate dispute of her own. Renata reviewed the codicil, the handwritten note, and Bradley's account of Gary's visit and explained plainly what I was actually facing. An unexecuted codicil on its own likely wouldn't be enforceable as a legal document. But my father's clear, documented intent, the handwritten note, his witnessed conversation with me on the porch, Bradley's own scheduling records showing the appointment my father never got the chance to keep, could potentially support a will contest, particularly given the additional troubling fact that Gary had knowingly concealed the existence of that intent from his co-beneficiaries. I want to be honest with you about something, the way I am with all my clients in your position, Renata said near the end of that first meeting. A case like this can take a year, sometimes more, and it can cost you real money before you see a dollar back, and there's no guarantee of the outcome. I've seen people pursue cases like this purely out of principle and come out the other side feeling like it was worth every bit of it. I've also seen people pursue them purely out of principle and come out feeling like it cost them more than the money was ever worth. I can't tell you which one you'll be. Only you know what you actually need out of this, the money, the acknowledgement, or simply the truth being said out loud in front of your family once clearly. Those aren't all the same goal, and it's worth being honest with yourself about which one you're actually chasing before we go any further. I asked Renata before I left that first meeting what she thought my chances actually were if it came to a full contest rather than a negotiated settlement. She was careful in her answer, the way good lawyers are careful with hope. Documented intent. A witness, you, who can testify to a direct conversation, a handwritten note in his own hand, and an attorney's own scheduling records showing an appointment that was never kept due to circumstances entirely outside your father's control. That's a stronger position than most people bring me. It's not a guarantee. But it's not nothing either, and frankly, Nora, the fact that your brother tried to keep this quiet rather than disclosing it and letting the matter be settled honestly from the start, that tells a probate judge something too, if it ever gets that far. Concealment has a way of speaking almost as loudly as the document itself. That question sat with me for the better part of 3 more weeks, longer than the 6-week window I mentioned at the start of this section. Because I found myself circling, again and again, the fear underneath the whole thing, the fear I finally said out loud to Priya on her back porch, on an evening I remember with total clarity. If I make this about money, I told her, I'm afraid it makes me exactly the kind of person my family always quietly believed I secretly was, greedy, keeping score, only ever loving Dad for what I'd get out of it. And if I don't do anything at all, I'm afraid I'm just proving the other thing they believe about me, that I'll absorb whatever's handed to me forever, because that's simply who I am, and nobody ever has to actually be fair to a person like that. I want to describe that evening on Priya's porch a little further, because I think it's the truest scene in this entire 6-week window. It was late September, the light going amber early the way it does in Vermont that time of year, and I remember Priya letting the silence sit for a long moment after I finished talking, not rushing to fill it the way people sometimes do when a friend says something raw. Her husband called from inside the house to ask if we wanted more wine, and she waved him off gently without looking away from me, and I remember being struck, in that small, ordinary gesture, by how different it felt to be fully attended to by someone who wasn't measuring the cost of the attention against anything else. Can I tell you what I actually think, plainly? Priya finally said. I nodded. I think you've spent your whole life terrified of being seen as someone who wants something for herself, because somewhere along the way your family taught you that wanting things was Denise's job and Gary's right, and your job was just to be grateful for whatever you were given. I don't think this is about greed, Nora. I think this is about whether you're finally willing to let yourself want something out loud without immediately apologizing for it. Priya didn't rush to reassure me. She let that sit for a moment before she said, Nora, I've watched you for 6 years. I've never once seen you ask for a single thing you weren't entitled to. I don't think the real question here is whether pursuing this makes you greedy. I think the real question is whether you're finally willing to let yourself be someone your family has to actually account for, instead of someone they simply get to assume will keep absorbing things quietly forever. Those are very different women, Nora. And I think you've spent your whole life being the second one because nobody ever showed you it was safe to be the first. That sentence is the one that finally moved me. Not because it resolved my fear entirely. I don't think fears like that ever fully resolve, even now, but because it gave me a way of understanding the decision that wasn't about greed or forgiveness at all. It was about whether I was finally willing to require my own family to see me clearly, on paper in a room in front of an attorney, instead of trusting that seeing me clearly was something they'd eventually get around to on their own. I decided in the end not to file the will contest immediately. I decided instead to do something I thought might actually matter more, both to me and to the truth of what had happened. I asked Bradley Sennett to call a formal meeting with Gary and Denise present, where I would lay out calmly exactly what I had found, and exactly what Bradley had told me about Gary's private visit, not as an ambush, but as the same kind of accounting I'd been quietly keeping in one form or another for 30 years. I wanted the truth said once, clearly, in a room, before either the law or my family got to decide what happened next. The confrontation. Bradley scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday in the same second-floor conference room where the original reading had taken place. A choice I made deliberately once he offered it, because I wanted this conversation to happen in the exact room where the other one had been allowed to stand unchallenged. I spent the morning of that Thursday the way I'd spent most mornings for 6 years. Up early, coffee, a quiet hour to myself before the day's obligations began, except this time there was no medication schedule to check, no appointment to drive anyone to. Just the house empty now except for me and the folder I'd finished preparing the night before, sitting on the kitchen table where my father used to eat breakfast every morning of his life. I remember standing in that kitchen, looking at the empty chair at the head of the table and saying out loud to no one, "I hope I'm doing this the way you'd have wanted, Dad." I don't know if I believed in any literal sense that he could hear me. I said it anyway because some part of this had never really been only about the money or even only about the truth. Some part of it was about finally, 6 years too late for him to see it, being the version of myself who didn't simply absorb whatever she was handed. I brought a folder of my own this time. Inside was a copy of the codicil, my father's handwritten note, and a simple one-page summary I'd prepared myself in plain language of the caregiving costs I'd absorbed over 6 years, $63,000, the number Priya had first prompted me to calculate, now organized cleanly by category and year. I didn't bring it to shame anyone with it. I brought it because I had spent 30 years being the only member of this family who kept an honest accounting of anything, and I intended, for the first time, to let that accounting be seen by everyone in the room at once. Gary arrived already tense, clearly having guessed from the tone of Bradley's call that this wasn't a routine follow-up. Denise arrived 12 minutes late, apologizing sweetly, settling into her chair with the same practiced softness she'd brought to the first reading. I remember watching the two of them settle into the same seats they'd taken at the original reading. An instinct so automatic that nobody even seemed to notice they were doing it. Gary at the end nearest Bradley. The position of authority he'd occupied at every family meeting since he was old enough to sit at the table, Denise beside him, close enough to be counted as present, comfortable in the role of concerned observer rather than active participant. I took the same seat I'd taken the first time too, near the far end, and I remember thinking, settling into it, that this was likely the last time this particular seating arrangement would ever feel automatic to any of us. I let Bradley open the meeting factually, the way we'd agreed beforehand. He explained plainly that a codicil drafted in April of the previous year had never been executed due to my father's hospitalization, that Gary had visited his office privately 6 days after the funeral and specifically asked that its existence not be raised at the reading, and that he, Bradley, now believed that omission had been a mistake on his part, professionally and ethically, one he wanted corrected in front of the whole family rather than left buried. Denise's hand went to her mouth. "Gary, is that true?" Gary's face had gone rigid, the particular rigidity of a man watching a carefully managed story collapse in real time. "It wasn't a valid document, Denise. Bradley just said so himself, unexecuted, unwitnessed, legally meaningless. I didn't lie to anyone. I just didn't see the point in dragging up some half-finished paperwork that was going to confuse everybody and drag this whole process out for months." "You didn't see the point," I said, opening my folder for the first time, my voice staying level, "in telling your sister that our father spent his last clear afternoon making sure I wasn't forgotten. You decided that was confusing, rather than telling me it existed and letting me decide for myself what to do with that information." "It wasn't final, Nora," Gary said, his voice rising, the first real crack in his composure. "You're acting like I stole something from you that never actually existed." "It existed," I said. "It existed in a drawer on Bradley's letterhead with a file number stamped on it, 3 days before Dad's appointment to make it official. It existed as a conversation he had with me on the porch, holding my hand, telling me he'd made sure I wasn't forgotten. Whether or not it was legally final, Gary, you knew what it represented and you made a private decision 6 days after we buried him to keep me from ever knowing it existed at all." Denise, still visibly stunned, turned to Gary with something harder than sympathy in her voice for the first time in the whole meeting. "You went to see Bradley 6 days after the funeral, Gary, while I was still driving up from Burlington every other day trying to help plan the service. You had time for that, but you didn't have time to mention it to either of us." "It wasn't relevant, Denise," Gary said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I told you it wasn't a valid document." "You don't get to decide what's relevant to me," Denise said, and I remember being genuinely surprised by the steadiness in her voice, a steadiness I hadn't heard from her in years. "You decided what was relevant to you, and you dressed it up as protecting the family. I think I'm finally seeing how many other things you've decided were not relevant to tell either of us over the years. I slid the second document across the table, the caregiving summary. I also want to put this in front of everyone because I think it's overdue. This is what I've spent in dollars alone over the last 6 years caring for Dad. $63,000, not counting the 6 years of my own life I gave up to be there every single day. I'm not showing you this because I think love should come with an invoice. I'm showing you this because for 30 years, this family has quietly assumed that whatever I gave without needing it accounted for, and I think it's time that assumption stopped being free. Denise, to her credit, was the one who finally cracked open something real. I didn't know it was that much, Nora. I really didn't. I told myself every year that I'd come up more, help more, and I let myself believe you didn't mind because it was easier than admitting I wasn't doing my part. Her eyes filled, genuinely this time, not the practiced softness of the first reading. I'm sorry, I don't know if that fixes anything, but I am. I remember watching Denise's face while she said this, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in that room. A kind of tired, complicated tenderness for her, even in the middle of everything. Denise had never been the architect of anything in this story. She'd simply been allowed her whole life to mistake warmth for contribution. The way a child raised on adoration alone rarely learns until something forces the lesson, that adoration and effort are not interchangeable currencies. I didn't say any of that to her in the moment. I simply nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that," because it was true, and because I'd learned over 6 weeks of careful preparation that not every response in that room needed to be a confrontation. Some of them just needed to be received. Gary, for his part, did not soften nearly as much, though even he had one unguarded moment, his voice suddenly smaller, younger almost, when he said, "I've spent 15 years thinking that store was mine because Dad and I built it back up together after Mom died. I think some part of me couldn't stand the idea that at the very end he decided the person who actually deserved the biggest piece of this family wasn't me. I'm not proud of what I did, but I understand now why I did it, and I don't think that makes it right." I want to give a little more room to that moment, because I think it's the truest thing Gary said all afternoon. He went on, quieter still, almost as if he were talking to himself as much as to the room. "You know, when Dad had his stroke scare that first year before the diagnosis, I remember driving to the hospital thinking if something happens to him, I'm the one who's supposed to hold this family together. That's just always been my job in my head. And somewhere in there, I think I started believing that holding the family together and owning the family's assets were the same thing, because nobody ever really separated them from me growing up. I've had a lot of time to think about that in the last few weeks. I don't like what I've found when I actually looked at it honestly. It wasn't a full accounting of what he'd done, but it was, I think, as close as Gary had ever come in either of our lifetimes to actually examining the story he'd told himself about his own place in this family. I let that sit in the room for a moment because I believed it, and because I think even the people who wrong us deserve to be heard honestly. Once, in the moment, they finally tell the truth. Then I said the line I'd been building toward quietly for 6 years without knowing it, and directly for the 6 weeks since I'd found that envelope. I spent 6 years being the one who showed up every single day without ever once asking this family to prove it noticed. I think I finally understand why that felt so unremarkable to everyone else, because I never once required it to be remarked on. I'm not asking anyone in this room to love me more than they already do. I'm asking this family to finally put in writing what showing up has actually been worth, because doing the work quietly for 30 years doesn't mean I was never in the room. It just made it easy for everyone else to forget I was. Bradley quietly closed his own folder. Given what's been said here today, and given the documentation Nora and I have reviewed, I'd recommend all 3 of you consider mediation regarding a revised distribution, rather than proceeding to a contested probate hearing that would take considerably longer and cost considerably more for everyone involved. Nobody argued with him. Gary sat very still for a long moment, then nodded once without meeting my eyes. Denise reached across the table and took my hand the way our father used to take mine and said simply, "Whatever's fair, Nora, I mean that." I want to close this section with one more detail, small but one I've thought about often since. As the meeting broke up, everyone gathering coats and folders, Bradley walked me out to the elevator and he said quietly just to me, "Your father would have been proud of how you handled that in there, Nora, not the folder. The way you said it, no shouting, no theatrics, just the truth laid out plainly. That's exactly how he did business his whole life. I think that's part of why he trusted you with all this in the first place." I didn't say much in response, but I've held onto that sentence since, because it was the first time since the will reading that someone had connected the calm, careful person I'd become over 6 years of caregiving directly to the calm, careful man my father had been his whole life, not as a coincidence, but as an inheritance in its own right, one that no document, executed or otherwise, could have ever taken from me. Mediation took 4 months, longer than I'd hoped, shorter than Renata had warned me it might. I won't pretend the outcome was a perfect mirror of the unexecuted codicil. The law doesn't work that cleanly, and Renata was honest with me throughout that we were negotiating from documented intent, not an enforceable document, which meant compromise on all sides. But the final agreement gave me the house outright, free of the sale clause and Gary's right of first refusal, along with 15% ownership in the rental properties and a lump sum reimbursement of $40,000 toward the caregiving costs I'd documented, not the full $63,000. But a number that felt, finally, like an actual acknowledgement rather than a compliment standing in for one. I want to describe one particular mediation session, the third one, because it's the moment I actually believed for the first time that this process was going to produce something real rather than simply more delay. Renata had prepared a detailed comparison, my documented contributions against Gary's and Denise's, laid out in the same plain, factual language I'd used at the conference table. And the mediator, a retired judge named Harlan Doyle, asked Gary directly whether he disputed any of the specific figures. Gary was quiet for a long moment, looking at the numbers, and then said quietly, "No, I don't dispute the numbers. I think I've just never let myself actually look at them laid out like this before." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the first moment in the entire process where I felt Gary was responding to the facts rather than to his own wounded sense of what he'd always assumed was coming to him. Gary and I are not close now, in the way we once, at least on the surface, appeared to be. He came to the mediation sessions, he signed the final agreement without further contest, and at our last group meeting he said stiffly, "I hope we can move past this eventually." I told him I hoped so too, and I meant it, though I also told him plainly that moving past it would take longer than a single meeting, and that I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make the room more comfortable. We speak now mostly at holidays, briefly, politely. It isn't warm. I've made my peace with the possibility that it may not become warm again for a long while, if ever, and I've stopped treating that as a personal failure the way I once would have. I want to be honest about my own harder moments in the months after the agreement was signed, because I don't think this story is well served by pretending the resolution felt clean the moment the paperwork was finalized. There was a stretch that winter where I found myself standing in my father's, now my kitchen, doing ordinary things like washing dishes or making tea, and suddenly, without warning, feeling a wave of something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. I'd spent 6 years in that kitchen taking care of a man I loved, and it took real deliberate work with Dr. Marsh's help to separate the genuine grief of losing my father from the leftover resentment of how his final wishes had nearly been erased. Some days I managed that separation well. Other days, honestly, I didn't, and I've come to believe that's simply part of what it looks like to grieve someone while also having had to fight formally for the truth of what they wanted for you. Denise, unexpectedly, is the relationship that's grown the most since that Thursday in the conference room. She's visited 4 times in the past year, more than she managed in the previous 3 combined, and last month she called simply to ask how she could help me with an ordinary Tuesday. My father's headstone needed a small repair, nothing urgent, and Denise drove up from Burlington unprompted to sit with me at the cemetery while the mason did the work. She said, standing there, "I used to think being the baby of the family meant I got to be loved without having to do anything to earn it. I don't think I understood until all this that you were the one actually earning something every single day and getting loved a whole lot less visibly for it. I'm sorry it took losing Dad for me to finally see that clearly." What's changed most concretely between Denise and me is something small but I've come to believe genuinely meaningful. She's started, unprompted, offering to split costs the moment they come up rather than waiting to be asked or assuming warmth alone was sufficient. When my car needed an unexpected repair that spring, she Venmo'd me $200 before I'd even finished telling the story, saying simply, I don't want to be the sibling who only shows up with feelings anymore. It's a small gesture in the scheme of $63,000 in 6 years, but I've come to understand that healing a pattern this old rarely arrives all at once. It arrives, if it arrives at all, in a series of small, deliberate corrections, each one proving the last one wasn't a fluke. The redemptive thread I want to leave you with is my niece, Ashley, now 22, the one who spent that summer, years ago, quietly helping with my father's care and telling me she saw what nobody else in the family seemed to. Ashley graduated from nursing school this spring, and she told me at her graduation dinner that watching me those summers, watching what real, sustained caregiving actually looked like, and watching later what it cost me to finally require my own family to account for it, shaped her decision to go into geriatric nursing specifically. I want to be good at the caring part, she said, but I also don't ever want to be the person in my own family who does everything and lets everyone just assume it's free. You taught me both halves of that, Aunt Nora, whether you meant to or not. I asked Ashley, that same dinner, whether she'd talked to her father, my brother, about any of this, and she said something that told me the ripple from that Thursday in the conference room was reaching further than I'd realized. I did, actually. I told him I thought what he did was wrong and that I didn't want to just quietly go along with pretending it wasn't, the way I think our whole family's always done with things that made us uncomfortable. He didn't love hearing it, but he didn't argue with me either. I think that's something. I think of everything that came out of these last 2 years, that conversation is the one I hold on to most, not because it undoes anything Gary did, but because it suggests that somewhere in the next generation of this family, the old machinery might actually be breaking down, one honest conversation at a time. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: doing the work quietly for years doesn't mean you were never in the room, it just makes it easy for everyone else to forget you were. Love that never has to be accounted for isn't stronger for its silence. It's simply easier for everyone else to underpay. If you've spent your life being the reliable one, the one nobody worries about because you never ask for anything, I want you to ask yourself what it would actually cost you to finally require the people you love to see the full weight of what you've carried. Not because you love them less, but because you've finally decided you're allowed to be seen clearly, in writing, in a room, instead of simply trusted to keep absorbing things forever. I think often about the sentence my father wrote in that Bible on his nightstand: Nora deserves better than what she's been given. I mean to fix it before I go, and about how close that sentence came to disappearing entirely, folded into a drawer, quietly outlived by a document 6 years older than his actual final wishes. I don't know that every story like this one ends with the real will surfacing in time. I know mine very nearly didn't. If there's a second lesson underneath the first, it's this: don't wait for someone else to finally notice what you've carried and write it down for you. Write it down yourself while you still can, in whatever form the truth takes: a spreadsheet, a folder, a single honest conversation at a table where everyone can hear it. The people who love us don't always get the chance to finish protecting us. Sometimes we have to finish the job ourselves. If this story found something true in your own family, I'd love to hear it in the comments, your version of the reliable one, or the moment you finally asked to be accounted for instead of simply appreciated. Share this with someone who spent years doing the quiet work nobody remembered to thank them for, and subscribe if you want more stories like Nora's. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.